In June 1800, the fate of Europe hung in the balance. For 12 tense hours at the Battle of Marengo, Napoleon Bonaparte fought not just for victory, but for the very survival of his rising power. What seemed like a crushing defeat turned into one of history's most dramatic reversals. A single day that reshaped empires and secured Napoleon's path to dominance. In the early summer of 1800, the war that engulfed Europe had entered a new and decisive phase, and France's first consul, Napoleon Bonaparte, understood that his political future and the fragile survival of the revolutionary state depended on swift and decisive action against Austria. Though much of Europe watched with uncertainty, Napoleon had crossed the formidable Alps with his army in a daring maneuver designed to outflank the Austrian forces operating in northern Italy. His goal was not only to reassert French control over the Italian territories, but also to force Austria to the peace table. Yet what unfolded at Marengo on June 14, 1800 demonstrated how perilously close Napoleon came to disaster, as a surprise Austrian offensive nearly shattered his army and his ambitions in one of the most precarious moments of his military career. The Austrians, under the command of General Michael von Melas, were seasoned and determined. Melas, though elderly and often physically weakened by the rigors of campaign, commanded a disciplined force of nearly 30,000 men, battle-hardened and confident after holding positions in Italy against repeated French attempts to dislodge them. Napoleon's crossing of the Alps had caught them off guard strategically, but tactically, the Austrian command saw opportunities to strike before the French could consolidate. By mid-June, both armies hovered uneasily in the plains of northern Italy, their scouts and skirmishers probing, their commanders plotting, each aware that the decisive battle was imminent. Melas had no intention of retreating. Instead, he devised a plan to strike suddenly and forcefully at the French positions, driving them back across the plain and potentially trapping Napoleon's army against the rivers and marshes. Napoleon's army, numbering roughly 22,000 at the time, was stretched thin and deployed in a manner that reflected both his confidence and his miscalculation of Austrian intentions. He believed that the Austrians were preparing to retreat eastward, and as such, he had dispersed portions of his force, with divisions spread across a wide front. This meant that on the morning of June 14, when the Austrians advanced in full strength, the French were not only unprepared for the scale of the attack, but also dangerously outnumbered at the decisive points of contact. Napoleon's camp near the village of Marengo exuded a sense of relative calm on the eve of battle. But before dawn the Austrian columns were already on the move, and the first sounds of cannon fire broke the silence of the Italian countryside. The Austrian plan was bold and aggressive. General Melas, despite his age, recognized that a sudden assault might unbalance the French. He ordered his divisions to advance across the Bormida River, which they had bridged during the night, and strike hard at the French positions near Marengo. The terrain itself played into their plan, for the rolling fields, vineyards, and irrigation ditches offered concealment for troops and artillery, enabling them to move forward with surprising speed. By dawn, Austrian infantry and artillery were already pressing against the French forward positions, catching them off guard and forcing them to fall back under pressure. The surprise was total, for Napoleon had not expected the Austrians to launch a full-scale offensive. His assumption had been that they would maneuver defensively, and perhaps seek a way to disengage. Instead, they were surging forward with determination, their columns supported by heavy cannon fire that tore into French lines. As the Austrian advance developed, it became clear that Napoleon's left wing and centre were under the heaviest pressure. The French troops under General Victor were among the first to feel the brunt of the attack. Victor's men, deployed near Marengo itself, were forced to resist against overwhelming numbers, their lines stretched thin and their positions steadily collapsing under artillery bombardment. The Austrians pressed with relentless energy, pushing the French back through vineyards and across ditches, forcing them to yield ground at every stage. General Lannes, commanding another division, sought to hold firm and provide support, but he too found himself heavily engaged as Austrian columns bore down upon his sector. The French soldiers, many veterans of earlier campaigns, fought stubbornly, but the sheer weight of Austrian numbers and the element of surprise were too much. The offensive gained momentum with every hour, As Melas committed more forces into the attack and his artillery continued its punishing fire for Napoleon, the unfolding situation was a moment of grave crisis. Reports reached him of the intensity of the Austrian assault and the precarious state of his divisions, and he quickly realized that his earlier assumptions about the enemy had been dangerously mistaken. What he had envisioned as a pursuit of retreating Austrians was rapidly transforming into a desperate battle for survival. The French army was being pushed steadily backward, the village of Marengo itself becoming a contested focal point as Austrian infantry stormed into its streets, forcing the French to fight house by house, yard by yard, in scenes of intense and chaotic struggle. The Austrians, sensing that victory was within their grasp, pressed with even greater urgency, their commanders urging them forward, determined to exploit the disarray in the French ranks. The psychological impact of the Austrian surprise was profound. French morale faltered as men, who had expected to march forward in triumph, instead found themselves reeling from the shock of the sudden assault. Units became disorganized under the relentless pressure, retreating piecemeal as Austrian cavalry probed for weaknesses and artillery continued its devastating bombardments. Napoleon himself, though renowned for his composure in battle, must have felt the creeping realization that his army stood on the brink of annihilation. The marshes and rivers behind his positions threatened to cut off retreat, and the Austrians seemed poised to encircle his forces completely. Every hour that passed tightened the vise, and though the French fought with grim determination, they were being driven steadily backward across the plain. General Melas, despite his age and infirmity, directed the offensive with energy. He had committed the majority of his forces early, seeking to break the French before they could rally or bring up reinforcements. His subordinates executed the plan with efficiency, pushing fresh troops into the battle as the morning wore on, maintaining the pressure without respite. By midday, the French lines had been forced back several kilometers from their original positions, and the situation grew increasingly desperate. The Austrian soldiers, encouraged by the sight of their enemy faltering, advanced with cheers, their confidence mounting as victory seemed within reach. At one point, Napoleon's army appeared on the verge of complete collapse, with whole sections retreating in disorder, and Austrian cavalry threatening to cut off their avenues of withdrawal. The intensity of the Austrian assault at Marengo revealed how fragile Napoleon's position truly was in those hours. Though history often remembers Napoleon as a figure of near-invincible genius, Marengo demonstrated that he was not immune to miscalculation or to the hazards of being caught unprepared. The Austrian surprise nearly destroyed not only his army, but also his carefully constructed political authority back in France, for a defeat on Italian soil would have reverberated across Europe and emboldened his enemies. In the smoke and confusion of the battlefield, the French soldiers fought desperately to hold their ground, but the Austrians' numerical superiority and the momentum of their offensive pushed them back, step by step, threatening to shatter the cohesion of the army altogether. By early afternoon, the French forces had been compressed into a dangerously narrow space, their backs to the Fontaine stream, with Austrian infantry and cavalry closing in relentlessly. The fields that had been calm the day before were now scenes of chaos, littered with fallen soldiers, broken cannon, and the wreckage of shattered formations. Every French counterattack seemed to falter under the weight of Austrian resistance, and though Napoleon moved among his men to rally them, urging them to stand firm, the truth was that the army was on the edge of destruction. In those harrowing hours, the outcome of the battle and the fate of Napoleon's ambitions hung by a thread, the Austrians pressing forward with the confidence of those who believed they had already secured victory. As the sun climbed higher over the fields of northern Italy on June 14, 1800, the French army reeled under the weight of the Austrian offensive that had caught them so unprepared in the early hours of the morning. For hours, wave after wave of Austrian infantry and cavalry had pressed against their lines, driving them steadily backward from their positions at Marengo and threatening to collapse the entire French defense. By midday, Napoleon Bonaparte's army looked broken, its divisions scattered, its men exhausted, its morale shaken by the ferocity of the attack. Yet within this crucible of apparent defeat lay the seeds of one of history's most extraordinary reversals. For the desperate French counterattack that unfolded later that afternoon would not only salvage the day, but would turn looming catastrophe into a resounding triumph. The way the counterattack came together was as much a product of instinct, discipline, and fortune as it was of design, but its effect was nothing short of transformative, rewriting the narrative of the battle, and with it the course of Napoleon's destiny. By early afternoon, Napoleon's forces had been forced several kilometers back from their morning positions. The French divisions under Generals Victor and Lannes had borne the brunt of the Austrian onslaught, and though they fought with determined resistance, the sheer scale of the enemy advance was overwhelming. Victor's men had been pushed through the village of Marengo itself, fighting a bitter contest in its narrow lanes before being driven back beyond the Fontaine stream. Lannes, commanding some of Napoleon's finest troops, had resisted with great stubbornness, but likewise had to yield ground under mounting pressure. The French army, compressed into a dangerously narrow space, now seemed poised to disintegrate entirely. The Austrians, under General Melas, believed victory was already at hand, and their soldiers advanced with cheers, convinced they were about to destroy Napoleon's army once and for all. The French retreat carried the appearance of disorder, their cannon abandoned, their ranks broken, their banners wavering in the smoke. Filled air, it was in this bleak moment that Napoleon's leadership revealed itself in new ways. Though the situation appeared hopeless, he refused to abandon the field or concede defeat. Riding among his troops, he sought to inspire them, reminding them of their past victories, urging them to stand firm a little longer, to trust that the tide could still turn. Yet inspiration alone was not enough. He needed fresh strength, and fortune provided it in the form of reinforcements that arrived at the most critical juncture. General Louis Desaix, commanding a division that had been detached on a reconnaissance mission earlier in the day, was marching back toward the battlefield after receiving word of the French predicament. Desaix's arrival, though delayed, proved decisive, for it brought not only several thousand fresh troops, but also renewed hope at the very moment when the army seemed on the verge of collapse. The soldiers who had been retreating in exhaustion looked up to see reinforcements approaching, and a murmur of renewed determination spread along the lines. Napoleon wasted no time in seizing the opportunity. He recognized that the Austrian army, though seemingly triumphant, had overextended itself. Melas, convinced that victory was secure, had already withdrawn to the rear to rest, leaving his subordinates to continue the pursuit. The Austrian columns, pressing forward with eagerness, had become stretched out across the battlefield, their formations elongated and their coordination weakened. It was a dangerous position, for an enemy who could strike swiftly and decisively might find them vulnerable in the very moment of their advance. Napoleon understood this and resolved to launch a counterattack with Desaix's fresh troops as the spearhead. The plan was audacious, for it required rallying his battered army, stabilizing the front, and then throwing everything into one desperate assault that might either snatch victory from the jaws of defeat or lead to utter annihilation. As Desaix conferred with Napoleon, he is reported to have remarked, "This battle is completely lost, but there is still time to win another." His words captured the paradoxical moment, for while the French army had been driven back and humiliated through the morning, the opportunity to reverse the outcome lay within reach, if they had the courage and strength to attempt it. Desaix's division took its place at the center of the French line, positioned to strike at the Austrian forces that were now strung out and less cohesive than before. Napoleon ordered his cavalry under General Kellerman to prepare for a decisive charge, one that would follow the infantry assault and, if timed correctly, shatter the Austrian momentum completely. The battered remnants of Victor's and Lannes's divisions were reorganized as best as possible, stiffening the line alongside the newcomers, their spirits lifted by the sight of Desaix's disciplined troops moving confidently into position. The counterattack began with sudden ferocity. Desaix's men surged forward against the advancing Austrians, their muskets unleashing disciplined volleys that cut into the enemy ranks. The Austrians, surprised by the renewed vigor of French resistance, hesitated for the first time that day, uncertain how to respond. They had believed the French were broken, yet here was a fresh division pressing against them with energy and determination. The clash was brutal, musket fire rippling across the fields, bayonets flashing as the two sides closed in deadly combat. Decisive himself rode at the forefront, inspiring his men with his presence, though he would pay the ultimate price when he was struck down by a musket ball in the chest. His death, though tragic, came at the moment of his greatest contribution, for his division had already steadied the French line and breathed new life into the army's spirit. With the Austrian advance blunted, Napoleon unleashed the cavalry. General Kellermann's dragoons thundered across the battlefield in a furious charge that struck the Austrian flank with devastating impact. The timing could not have been more perfect, for the Austrian columns, stretched and vulnerable, were ill prepared to withstand such a sudden and violent assault. Horses crashed into infantry, sabers slashed through enemy ranks, and panic spread rapidly as Austrian units began to falter under the weight of the charge. What had only moments before seemed like a relentless tide of Austrian success now began to unravel in confusion and disorder. Soldiers who had advanced confidently through the morning now found themselves retreating, their formations breaking apart as French cavalry and infantry pressed them with renewed fury. The transformation of the battlefield was astonishing in its swiftness. The French soldiers, who had been retreating in exhaustion only hours earlier, now surged forward with cries of vengeance, their morale rekindled by the sudden reversal of fortune. The Austrians, who had believed themselves victors, now faced the nightmare of collapse, their extended lines vulnerable to encirclement. French artillery, hastily repositioned, poured fire into the retreating enemy, adding to the chaos. The counterattack rolled across the field with unstoppable momentum, sweeping up men and banners, reclaiming ground that had been lost earlier in the day. Villages and vineyards that had echoed with Austrian cheers in the morning now resounded with French shouts of triumph. As the tide of battle turned decisively, the death of Decisive was deeply felt among the French troops, yet it only seemed to harden their resolve. His division, inspired by his final example, pressed the attack with unyielding determination, driving the Austrians back step by step. Kellermann's cavalry, emboldened by their initial success, launched further charges that scattered enemy formations and captured artillery pieces. Napoleon himself, observing the transformation, directed his forces with precision, ensuring that the momentum of the counterattack was maintained and that no opportunity for exploitation was missed. He understood that this was the decisive moment, the hinge upon which the fate of the entire battle rested, and he committed everything to ensuring that the Austrians were not merely repelled but routed. For the Austrian army, the shock was devastating. General Melas, who had withdrawn to rest, was slow to realize the scale of the reversal, and by the time he attempted to reassert control, the momentum of the French counterattack was unstoppable. His subordinates, overwhelmed by the suddenness of the French resurgence, struggled to rally their men, but panic spread faster than orders could be given. Columns that had marched confidently through the morning now broke apart in confusion, men fleeing across the fields, pursued by French cavalry and harried by musket fire. The battlefield that had seemed a stage for Austrian triumph only hours before had become a scene of chaos and disaster, with thousands of soldiers retreating in disorder and leaving behind the spoils of their earlier advance. What made the counterattack so remarkable was not only its effect, but its timing. Launched at the very moment when the French seemed most broken, it reversed not just the physical course of the battle, but also its psychological dimension. The Austrian soldiers, who had tasted the certainty of victory, now confronted the terror of sudden defeat, while the French, who had felt the bitterness of collapse, now embraced the exhilaration of resurgence. The pendulum of battle swung with dramatic force, and in that swing lay the essence of Napoleon's genius: the ability to seize opportunity in the darkest of moments, to transform desperation into triumph through audacity, discipline, and sheer will. The outcome of the Battle of Marengo reverberated far beyond the fields of northern Italy, for what unfolded there on June 14, 1800, transformed not only the course of a campaign, but the trajectory of Napoleon Bonaparte's entire career. In the hours before Decisive's counterattack, the French first consul had come close to the brink of disaster, yet by nightfall the victory was his, and with that victory came an aura of inevitability that no rival could easily challenge. Marengo became a defining moment not because it was Napoleon's greatest tactical masterpiece, but because it secured his fragile hold on power at home, reshaped European diplomacy, and cemented the image of his personal destiny as intertwined with the fate of France. The battle itself was brutal, costly, and nearly lost, yet in its aftermath Napoleon emerged stronger than ever, his authority bolstered by both the perception of triumph and the tangible political consequences that followed when Napoleon seized power in the coup of 18 Brumaire in November 1799. He did so as a man of immense promise, but also immense risk. The French Republic was unstable, racked by factionalism, economic hardship, and exhaustion from nearly a decade of war. The new constitution that established the consulate placed him as first consul, but his position was not yet unassailable. Many in France regarded him as another ambitious general who might soon falter, and his enemies abroad viewed him as a temporary figure, one who might be unseated by military setbacks or political infighting. To secure his authority, Napoleon needed a victory of sufficient magnitude to silence doubts and to remind France that under his leadership its armies could still triumph as they had during the Revolutionary Wars. Marengo, therefore, was not merely a battle between two armies, it was a test of legitimacy for a man whose power was still precarious and whose survival depended on his ability to prove himself on the field of war. The Austrian offensive that morning had nearly stripped him of that chance. Had Melas triumphed, Napoleon's political capital would have been shattered. His opponents in France would have accused him of reckless adventurism, and his enemies in Europe would have pressed their advantage against a weakened republic. The aura of invincibility that he cultivated so carefully would have been punctured at the very outset of his rule. Yet the victory, snatched in the last hours of battle, erased the memory of the French retreat and replaced it with a narrative of resilience, genius, and inevitable triumph. In Paris, news of the Austrian offensive would arrive muted and delayed, but the story of the French counterattack and decisive victory would spread like wildfire, capturing imaginations and confirming for many that Napoleon was not merely another general, but a leader destined to dominate events. Marengo's significance lay partly in its timing. The French Revolution had entered its second decade, and its people were wary of turmoil. The revolutionary ideals that had once inspired Europe were dimmed by years of conflict, executions, and shifting regimes. Napoleon's rise promised stability and renewed strength, but he needed a demonstration that his rule would deliver more than promises. Marengo provided that demonstration. It became the proof that the Republic, under his leadership, could not only defend itself, but expand its influence once more. Within days of the victory, newspapers across France celebrated the battle as a turning point, embellishing details, downplaying the near disaster, and instead highlighting the brilliance of the counterattack. Desaix's heroic death was cast as a noble sacrifice, Kellermann's cavalry charge as a stroke of brilliance, and Napoleon's calm presence as the guiding force that had transformed chaos into victory. The narrative was carefully shaped, yet it resonated with a population eager for hope and stability. The political dividends were immediate. Napoleon returned to France with the prestige of a conqueror, his position within the consulate elevated above that of his colleagues, Cambaceres and Lebrun, whose names faded ever further from public memory. The French people, still acclimating to the new constitution, increasingly regarded him not as the first among equals, but as the singular figure who embodied the state. The aura of Marengo magnified his authority, allowing him to push forward reforms with less resistance. His domestic agenda, including administrative centralization, legal codification, and the reorganization of education, gained momentum under the shadow of military success. Victory in Italy reassured skeptics that his government was not a fragile experiment, but the beginning of a new era, one in which military strength and political order went hand in hand. On the diplomatic stage, Marengo forced Austria into retreat and set the stage for the Treaty of Lunéville, signed in early 1801. Though the Austrians had fought tenaciously at Marengo, their defeat shattered their Italian campaign and weakened their bargaining position. The treaty that followed confirmed French dominance in northern Italy, securing the Cisalpine Republic and reshaping the balance of power in the region. To other European powers, the message was clear: Napoleon had consolidated control over the Italian peninsula and proven that his armies could not be dislodged easily. Britain, though still defiant, faced the reality that Austria's willingness to continue the struggle had been broken, and French diplomatic leverage increased accordingly. The battlefield triumph thus translated directly into strategic advantage, cementing Napoleon's reputation not only as a soldier, but as a statesman capable of reshaping Europe through both force and negotiation. The symbolic power of Marengo cannot be overstated. For the French people, it became not just another victory, but a legend. Artists painted scenes of the battle, often portraying Napoleon at the center, calm and resolute, the embodiment of leadership. Propagandists ensured that the memory of the desperate retreat in the morning was erased, replaced with tales of an orchestrated masterstroke in the afternoon. In reality, the counterattack had been as much the product of fortune and improvisation as of design, yet in the telling it became proof of Napoleon's unmatched genius. The myth of Marengo grew until it overshadowed the messy reality, and in that myth Napoleon found one of the cornerstones of his authority. To the French, he appeared touched by destiny, a leader whose presence alone could reverse disaster and conjure victory from defeat. This myth-making was not accidental. Napoleon himself understood the importance of narrative, and he encouraged the glorification of Marengo as a moment of near divine intervention in his favor. Coins were minted, medals struck, and official bulletins distributed to ensure that every corner of France knew of the triumph. The memory of Desaix was enshrined in honor, his death recast as the noble sacrifice that allowed Napoleon to deliver victory. Kellermann's cavalry charge, decisive though it had been, was subsumed into the larger narrative of Napoleon's leadership, further consolidating the sense that all success flowed from him. The battle became not just a military victory, but a political foundation stone, one that would support his eventual elevation from first consul to consul for life, and later to emperor of the French. Within the army itself, the victory reinforced loyalty to Napoleon. Soldiers, who had experienced the terror of retreat in the morning and the exhilaration of triumph in the afternoon, came away with a renewed sense of their commander's ability to lead them through any trial. Veterans told stories of the day with pride, their accounts feeding the growing legend. Officers who had fought at Marengo carried the prestige of the victory with them throughout their careers, binding them more closely to Napoleon's fortunes. The army, already the most powerful institution in post-revolutionary France, became inseparable from his authority, for its loyalty was now entwined with his personal aura of victory. Marengo was the crucible in which that bond was reforged, ensuring that when Napoleon needed the support of his soldiers to secure his later political moves, he could rely on them with confidence. The international consequences extended beyond Austria. In Italy, the French victory strengthened the client republics that Napoleon had established, reinforcing the perception that France was the dominant power in the region. The Pope, though still maintaining independence, recognized the necessity of accommodation, and local rulers understood that resistance would be futile. In Germany, too, the shock of Austria's defeat reverberated, weakening anti-French coalitions and sowing doubts about the ability of traditional monarchies to resist French arms. Across Europe, rulers and diplomats alike were forced to reckon with the reality that Napoleon was not a temporary figure, but a rising force whose influence would shape the continent's future. Marengo thus marked the beginning of an era in which Napoleon was not merely a general among generals, but the central actor in European affairs, a role that would define the next 15 years back in France. The cultural impact of the battle further cemented Napoleon's stature. Writers, poets, and composers drew inspiration from the victory, turning it into a symbol of renewal after years of revolutionary turbulence. The name, Marengo, itself became immortalized, attached to streets, monuments, and even culinary creations such as chicken Marengo, said to have been improvised from the spoils of the battlefield. Every retelling added new layers to the legend, ensuring that the memory of Napoleon at Marengo endured long after the actual details had faded. This cultural embedding of the victory reinforced his political legitimacy, for it placed him not only in the realm of governance and war, but also in the imagination of the people. Where myth and history blended seamlessly, the consolidation of Napoleon's power after Marengo was not without its challenges. Factions within France still harbored resentment, and foreign enemies still plotted resistance. Yet the battle had tipped the scales decisively in his favor. It demonstrated that he could deliver victory at the most crucial moments, that under his leadership France would not falter. This credibility allowed him to navigate political intrigue, suppress dissent, and advance reforms with greater ease. Each subsequent success built upon the foundation laid at Marengo, but none would ever carry quite the same symbolic weight, for it was at Marengo that Napoleon proved not only to France, but to himself that he was the indispensable man, the figure around whom the destiny of the nation revolved.